Hey, the reverser's deployed.
Jesus Christ. Wait a minute. Damn it!
A Boeing 767 of the Austrian airline Lauda Air was operating a scheduled flight. The route? From Bangkok, Thailand, to Vienna, Austria. Late spring. Many people are flying on vacation or returning home, and the aircraft is almost full. With a capacity of 223 passengers, 213 are on board, plus 10 crew members. 15 minutes after takeoff, at an altitude of 7,600 meters, about 24,900 feet, the first officer notices strange engine behavior and says, "It looks like the thrust reverser is engaged." The crew must react immediately and try to save the airplane, if that's even possible. 1979. World-famous Formula One champion Niki Lauda decides to create his own airline. At this time, his racing career is winding down. A year earlier, he left Ferrari and joined the Brabham team. He also holds a pilot's license, which he obtained 4 years earlier, allowing him to fly small, private aircraft. He names the airline simply Lauda Air. At first, it operates only charter flights, since a regular service license is still pending. 8 years later, in 1987, the airline receives it, and 4 years after that, in 1991, Lauda Air gains approval for international flights. By then, Niki himself also upgrades his license, now qualified to operate passenger jets. Since 1989, Lauda Air had been flying long-haul charter routes from Vienna to Sydney and Melbourne via Bangkok. By 1991, after gaining passenger certification, the number of flights increased, including new destinations such as Hong Kong. And so, on May 26, 1991, Lauda Air was performing one of its regular flights, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Vienna. For this flight, the airline assigned a very young Boeing 767, delivered from the factory just a year and a half earlier. The aircraft had been officially named Mozart. The first segment, Hong Kong to Bangkok, went smoothly. The aircraft landed at Bangkok's Don Muang Airport at 21:22 local time. Ground crews serviced the jet, passengers were exchanged, and the flight crew changed as well. For the Bangkok-Vienna leg, 2 pilots were in command. Captain Thomas John Welch, 48 years old, an American with nearly 12,000 flight hours. First Officer Joseph Thumer, 41 years old, an Austrian with around 6,500 flight hours. Thumer had even flown with Niki Lauda himself once on a trip to Bangkok. It was a long 10-hour flight ahead, so the airline ensured both pilots were well rested. Before the flight, they had enjoyed several warm days in Thailand. The temperature outside averaged 30 degrees Celsius. Even at night, it was around 26 degrees Celsius. All pre-flight procedures were completed thoroughly. At 22:45, the controller cleared them to taxi to the runway. At 23:02, the Boeing took off from Bangkok, heading for Vienna. Everything went according to plan, for exactly 5 minutes and 45 seconds. At 3,350 meters altitude, a message appeared on the flight displays, warning of a thrust reverser system fault. The computer indicated that one of the engines might engage reverse thrust on its own.
Damn. This message keeps coming on and off. What does the manual say about it?
Additional system faults may cause the thrust reverser to deploy in flight. Should I ask the technicians on the ground?
Yes, ask them. You can tell them it's probably just, well, maybe some moisture or something. Actually, never mind. It's just a warning. I'm sure everything's fine. The crew continues climbing. 9 minutes later, at an altitude of 7,600 meters, about 24,900 feet, a new message appears on the pilot's monitors. Unfortunately, this time it is not a warning. First Officer Thumer.
Hey, the reverser's deployed.
Over mountainous terrain and dense jungle, the thrust reverser on the left engine engages. In automotive terms, at a speed of 828 kilometers per hour, about 514 miles per hour, the airplane's left engine suddenly switches into reverse gear. The aircraft begins to shake violently. Asymmetry develops, and the plane turns sharply to the left. The lift on the left wing drops by 25%. The captain tries to save the airplane. He first sets the left engine to idle thrust, and then completely cuts off fuel to it. Too late. The Boeing enters a dive. Now the 180-ton machine is uncontrollable. The last words spoken by the captain are,
Jesus Christ! Wait a minute. Damn it!
The cockpit voice recorder captures the sound of breaking metal. The aircraft gains tremendous speed. 29 seconds after the reverser deployed, it reaches an altitude of only 1,200 meters, about 3,900 feet. The G-forces are enormous, and the tail section breaks off. Then parts of the wings and both engines separate. The airplane disintegrates in midair, and fragments scatter over an area of 1 square kilometer. All 223 people on board die. Some are ejected from the cabin in flight. Others hit the ground at a speed greater than the speed of sound. At that moment, another aircraft was flying nearby. Its captain later recalled, "I saw a large orange fireball." A massive fireball was falling very fast, forming a cylindrical shape until it hit the ground, remembered Delta Airlines Captain Donald Hellock. The results of the search and rescue operation were horrifying. The conditions at the crash site were unbearable. Temperatures around 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and 90% humidity. Volunteer rescue teams, mostly poor local villagers, began looting. Rings were stripped from the fingers of the dead, wallets were stolen, and anything that could be carried away was taken. No one could stop those people. They were even tearing rings off the fingers of the victims, recalled Niki Lauda later. Rescuers who arrived found the body of Captain Welch still strapped in his pilot seat. The crash of Flight 0004 claimed the lives of all 223 people on board. At that time in Vienna, it was 1817. No one yet knew what had happened. Only at 22:57 Austrian time did the first message appear. An Austrian airliner has exploded in the air over Thailand. Veteran Hans-Georg Heinke read the official statement, reporting that a Lauda Air Boeing 767 had crashed shortly after takeoff from Bangkok. Families flooded airline phone lines. Austrian President Kurt Waldheim was informed at midnight 20. Shortly after 1 a.m., a special hotline for relatives was opened at Vienna Airport, and by 2 a.m., the first families had arrived, isolated from the press in a private room. To this day, the crash of Lauda Air Flight 004 remains the deadliest disaster in Austrian civil aviation history, and the largest aviation accident ever to occur in Thailand involving a Boeing 767. The tragedy caused enormous public outrage, not only in Austria, but around the world. Niki Lauda, the owner of the airline, personally flew to Thailand to participate in the search and investigation. But what caused such a terrible catastrophe? Why did the engine of one of the most advanced aircraft in the world suddenly switch into reverse thrust? The investigation was far from simple. The flight data recorder was completely destroyed. Only the cockpit voice recorder could be analyzed. The only thing that became clear was that the left engine's thrust reverser had deployed. With only this information, Thai authorities continued their investigation. Niki Lauda decided to conduct his own. It was believed that the issue was manageable and could not have caused the crash. That meant either the pilots had made a mistake or something else had failed. Niki was certain the pilots were not to blame and set out to prove it, to the world and to Boeing. He flew to Seattle, to Boeing's headquarters. Irritated by the lack of comment from the company, he used Boeing's simulators to recreate the disaster and tried 15 times to save the aircraft. Each attempt ended exactly as on May 26th. Lauda demanded Boeing admit the problem was in the aircraft. At the time, hundreds of 767s were flying worldwide, and everyone believed reverser activation in flight could be controlled. Boeing stalled, saying it needed 3 months to prepare an explanation to avoid endless lawsuits. Unconvinced, Lauda held a press conference. He demanded Boeing give him a real aircraft and a co-pilot to recreate the situation in flight. Boeing engineers dismissed the idea, but his media influence forced them to act. Tests were conducted, and even test pilots failed to recover. How was the Boeing 767 certified at all? During certification tests, reverser deployment was performed not at 500 kilometers per hour, 310 miles per hour, as in real flight, but at 370 kilometers per hour, 230 miles per hour, and at an altitude of only 3,000 meters, 9,800 feet. Under those conditions, pilots easily regained control. The data was then extrapolated and never verified. That's how the 767 was certified. From then on, everyone believed in-flight reverser activation wasn't dangerous. Only after the investigation did it become clear. It was all a lie. 8 months later, the official report was released. The cause of the crash was listed as thrust reverser deployment, but the exact reason for that deployment was never determined. The mistakes of the American manufacturer were clear and shown to the world. What about the operator and pilots? Why did hundreds of other 767s fly for years with the same issue, and only this one crash? All Lauda Air technical logs were reviewed, and the results were troubling. In the 9 months before the crash, Lauda's mechanics performed 13 repairs to the left engine's reverser system. Despite multiple valve replacements, problems persisted, but the plane continued flying on schedule. The aircraft also repeatedly showed the EEC maintenance message, a warning from the electronic engine control system that regulates fuel, guide vanes, and other parameters. Regulations allow flight with that message for no more than 500 hours. But Lauda's maintenance teams simply reset the counter. This aircraft flew 1,800 hours with the fault, 3.5 times over the limit. Problems were ignored, and some maintenance was done against Boeing's recommendations, including rewiring and part replacements. Niki never mentioned this in his investigation. Boeing later stated that other 767s had also shown reverser warnings in flight, but never an actual deployment. When such a warning appears, the crew must adjust altitude, speed, and thrust to minimize control loss risk. That procedure wasn't followed either. All this didn't absolve Boeing, but it showed that Lauda Air wasn't as flawless as Niki portrayed. After the crash, Boeing advised all 1,600 aircraft with similar reverser systems to replace a potentially faulty valve. The system was redesigned, adding a pressure sensor and other safety measures. Within 6 months, all aircraft were modified. Lauda Air faced lawsuits and sanctions. Niki Lauda resigned as CEO, staying only on the board. In December 2000, Lauda Air became part of Austrian Airlines. Eventually, Niki left the company entirely. He had retired from Formula One 6 years before the crash, with 3 world titles. In aviation, he tried again, twice. In 2003, he founded Niki, which collapsed in 2017 after a failed Lufthansa deal. In 2018, he founded Lauda Motion. Niki Lauda passed away in 2019. His final airline became part of Ryanair, and flights under the Lauda name continue to this day. Captain Michael Anderson, former airline pilot and flight instructor. A thrust reverser failure is a case where reaction time is absolutely critical. When an emergency starts to develop, it's hard to identify, but easy to handle. Once it fully develops, it's easy to identify, but almost impossible to handle. They had 5 to 7 seconds to react, shut down the engine, apply opposite rudder and aileron, counter the roll, even reduce power on the working engine. But the crew hesitated. Their psychological state is understandable, but identifying this failure isn't difficult. The reverse light comes on, and the aircraft behaves exactly as expected. The good news? Such cases no longer happen. Modern protections prevent reverser deployment above 10 feet, with throttles at idle and landing gear compressed. David Miller, Director of Maintenance for an international airline. It's clear Lauda's engineers were dealing with recurring reverser issues, trying to locate an intermittent fault. But this wasn't the crash cause, as the report confirms. Their approach was typical of airlines troubleshooting technical faults. Not contacting Boeing was a mistake, but not a universal solution either. The main causes were the reverser's unreliable safety design and the certification authorities' failure to assess its danger. Boeing certified its aircraft under FAA standards. If the certification basis is flawed, responsibility lies with those who wrote it. At the time, industry experts believed reverser activation was only dangerous at low speeds and altitudes. High-speed, high-altitude events weren't seen as critical. But 1970s aerodynamic advances, shorter pylons, engines placed in front of the wing, caused an unexpected effect. The reverse jet stream hit the wing's upper surface, destroying lift. This was only discovered after Lauda Air 004. Even years later, Boeing and the FAA continued studying the issue, later improving wide-body aircraft with different engine types.